we dig into some of the more obscure series of survival horror titles that hit the PlayStation and tried to capitalize on Resident Evil's success. It's been well over 2 decades since the original Resident Evil first hit the PlayStation and forever changed survival horror gaming for the console. Capcom wouldn't necessarily perfect the Resident Evil formula until its sequel, but the first game in the series showed many other developers not only what could be possible but that there was a very viable market for survival horror titles. The first Resident Evil is a charming, groundbreaking video game, but it's also incredibly rough around the edges. It's because of the thought and care that was put into the title and its world that make it rise above its imperfections and become a classic. Some comically bad voice acting doesn't hurt either. It would be 2 years after the release of Resident Evil that its sequel would come out, and many companies took advantage of that window and tried to replicate Resident Evil's formula and make their own popular horror franchise. Judging by the fact that the Resident Evil series is still going strong and the majority of these clones came, went, and were forgotten rather quickly only speaks to the resilience of Capcom's survival horror hit. However, since so many of these games turn out to be such bizarre disasters, here's a look at a number of PlayStation survival horror games that did their best Resident Evil impressions to middling success. Countdown: Vampires. Imagine Resident Evil, but with vampires. That may be an oversimplification of Countdown, Vampire, Banai's attempt at the survival horror genre, but that's pretty much what's going on here. Casino City is evidently no Raccoon City, and this is a lesser version of Resident Evil in every way, right down to the item menus, which are nearly identical. There's a highly monotonous mix of fighting monsters, solving mild puzzles, and acquiring keycards. Even though Countdown, Vampire's bestiary of creatures expands to werewolves and giant insects, the fact that it looks quite poor for a 2000 release and plays worse than the original Resident Evil when the third title was already out at this point erase much of this goodwill. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the title is that it allows you to even anesthetize and save the vampires that you encounter, or just kill them, with this ultimately affecting your final score and which ending you'll receive. The problem with this mechanic is that it takes so much more work and time to save a vampire that it instantly becomes not worth it and a lost cause.